Hello, and thank you all for joining us this afternoon. Today we're going to speak about the future of journalism as facilitated by a new technology, virtual reality. If you have any questions about what I share today, you're welcome to reach out to me by Twitter. My contact is @SibleySpeaks. I will also reference several of the materials that I mentioned today on my Twitter. And without further ado, let's begin. We live in a brave new age, an age of information. We create the same amount of data in every 2 days that we used to create from the beginning of civilization all the way to 2003. That is a lot of data. Most of that data, or much of it at least, is at our fingertips. We have the ability to manipulate, interact with, and model this data in all new ways. In fact, most of you in this audience, I bet, are carrying a cell phone. Who has a cell phone on them right now? A lot of you. That means you have essentially the sum total of human knowledge in your pocket. We're also increasingly connected. By the year 2020, according to a study earlier this year, 90% of humanity age 6 and older will have a mobile phone, just like many of you in this audience. But is all of that information and connectivity bringing us closer together? Or is it tearing us farther apart? And as we navigate this information, how do we know how to make sense of it, what to trust, how to synthesize it? We have a science of making sense of information and distilling it into knowledge. It is one of the oldest sciences in human existence. Scientific American called it the physics of people. Story. In fact, all of your brains are hardwired for story. We bathe our babies in story to teach them how to navigate the world, how to understand their own emotions, how to relate to things that are other than their own human experience. Story is as old as we are. We've been telling stories since we sat around campfires, and the way we tell stories change. Sometimes it looks like this, like a person standing in front of you, telling you of their own experiences. Sometimes it's drama on a stage, other times it's music. We'll see some of that on Sunday. It can also look like cinema, television, tweets, Facebook posts. We have so many ways of telling stories, and we're gaining new ones. Who knows what this is? Raise your hand. Now keep your hands up if you've ever tried it. All right, some of us have. Keep your hand up if you've ever made content for this. All right, now I know our audience a little better. One right here. This is virtual reality. This is a new storytelling technology of our time. And today we're going to discuss how we might leverage that to tell meaningful stories of the future. And how each of you, as edgewalkers, as individuals who come from across a region to build connectivity and understanding, can leverage this to great effect. This is a $162 billion industry by the year 2020, according to IDC. Most of that will be hardware, much of it will be software, and content is critical to all of that. This is how it will evolve. For those of you who are unfamiliar with virtual reality, this is a moment for you to essentially come to know it. We began virtual reality with wired VR over here. This is connected headsets that are plugged into a computer. Most of the time you're seated because you're wired in, and you're able to put on a headset and look around an all-new world. In the middle, we have mobile VR, which is what we're charging towards right now. Although you don't see many of these on the market yet, I have tested the early prototypes, and you will be seeing these next year en masse. We have a few in the market now. Over here is what we are all headed towards, mixed reality, which is essentially when the digital world overlays our physical world. So that as you're looking at me or looking at each other around the room, instead of wondering, what is that person's name? You could potentially turn on LinkedIn and see their name, their title, their recent work. You could walk down the street in the city, and instead of having to look at Google Maps, you could see directions on the buildings. That is the future we are moving towards, and that is the future that your children will inhabit, the future of mixed reality. This is a tool that is indicative of our time. We live in an information age, which means that we are constantly compacting and abstracting information in order to store it around us. Our ancestors experienced information in a very different way. It was physicalized, it was concrete, it was literal. It was the savannah. Our grandparents experienced slightly more tightly packed information, the storefront of their youth. And we now live inside an abstracted world where user interfaces compact information, where your physical clock is now a digital clock, where your physical inbox is now a digital inbox. As we abstract knowledge, we compress it, we increase cognitive load, and we increase multitasking. This is a challenge because it means that we are constantly inundated with information, and a wealth of information creates a poverty. You are all rich in information, but what does that wealth consume? It consumes your attention, what you are all very kindly giving to me right now. Your attention is one of your most scarce resources, and I would encourage you, please remember to wield it well. Any CEO will tell you that leveraging your attention effectively is one of the most critical attributes of your success. What if we could physicalize this information? What if, instead of having to find it on these little screens, we could unleash it? We could break apart these little boxes that live inside our pockets and just layer it over the physical world and interact with it. What if we could use virtual, augmented, and mixed reality to make sense of information in a physical way? Why would that matter? It matters because that's how we learn best. My parents founded a school, a Montessori school. Those of you who are unfamiliar with Montessori education, there is a main edict. It goes like this: I hear and I forget. I see and I remember. I do and I understand. That means we learn through doing. We learn through immersion. We learn with our bodies. Strange that most of our information is shared through reading. I wonder why that could be. We have a great hunger for information. It scales well in the written word. We continue to consume it, although in a slightly different form. But what if we could consume this information, this compacted story world, in a way that was a bit more physicalized? What if we could live it? What if we could understand each other's realities as deeply as we understand our own? That's what VR makes possible. But it's just a tool. It's not a magic panacea. You can't just slap VR on something and have it work. You have to understand it. So what is it good for? 4 things. I use the DICE acronym, D-I-C-E. The dangerous, the expensive, the counterproductive, and the impossible. These are use cases perfectly suited to VR. And there are several ways that we can tell stories in this medium. The first we'll discuss is 360 video. This is what I suspect most of you have seen before. Here is a snapshot of the New York Times' very well-known 360 video called The Displaced. It describes the lives of half of the world's displaced people, who are children, 30 million children. And in making this story accessible, massive widespread awareness was put on this issue. You can find these on YouTube. On YouTube, you can actually navigate and move around the screen. Right now, you're only seeing a section of it. Another form of VR is computer-generated imagery, also known as CGI. This is essentially when you render the world around you with a game engine, which means that you are mocking up a world with a computer graphic. This is a section of The Guardian's work called 6x9 about solitary confinement. Essentially, you'll see that the space looks a lot like the real experience, which you now see depicted, but it was being manipulated. You were still, as a viewer, stuck in one place. The benefit of 360 video is that it essentially makes the virtual world accessible to you as it is in real life. So it renders people with the intimacy and realistic depiction that you all know from video and film. But what if we wanted to use CGI and make it possible to move around? This increases immersion, and it also increases empathy and understanding. And that's what happened in this piece, made in 2012 by Noni de la Peña. Many, many people came to see it, and it depicted what it would be like to grow up in LA, not have enough food, and to essentially go hungry. This is a diabetic man who fell down. People were able to walk around and interact with this person, digital person. Does anyone know what this is? Raise your hand if you do. This is Space VR. This world is full of people. I've given talks in this world, just as I'm giving talks to you now. These people are from 25 different countries, but they happen to be in the same room with each other. Yes, they're in avatars, but they are in shared space. They're sharing information. And the people who come to these talks are very different than the audience we have here. Yes, all of you could come, but in this room, when I speak to this room, I speak to people with social anxiety, with the elderly, people who are in their 80s who don't have the physical capacity to come and sit here like all of you. It's a fascinating way to connect with people, and it brings accessible information into the world in a whole new way. But there are some issues that we should watch out for. Safety and ethics definitely must be concerned. They're to be considered, and they are a concern. So for example, research on the impact of VR on brain development and vision is critical. One of the critical features is the fact that our brain has neuroplasticity. When you experience VR, it literally changes the way you think about the world. That could mean that if you put someone inside, for example, a war zone conflict, they could experience PTSD. What are the ethics of that situation? We have to think through those very clearly. How do we design headsets for children? Currently, they're designed for adults. They don't fit very effectively. What does that mean for cognitive development for children? We need research on that topic. Right now, the limit for VR is age 12 to 13 for children. And finally, how do we ensure safety and comfort? VR is an amazing data capture machine. Although right now, you essentially navigate it with your sense of sight and your sense of sound. You could ultimately use voice capture, voice interaction. There could be smell. It could track your movements in space. And so how do we make sure that we are keeping our information safe and keeping it where we want it to be? These are all considerations that we have to take into account when we leverage VR. So ultimately, what I want to show all of you, because I can't put every single one of you in a headset, is what does it mean to represent information in a new way, to make it physical, to make it visceral, to put you in close location to that information? Because that's what VR does. We are hardwired, again, to care about what is local to us. We have always understood the world in proximity. And VR makes everything proximate. It makes everything intimate to you. This is one of my favorite thinkers, Buckminster Fuller. And he said, if you want to teach people a new way of thinking, don't bother trying to teach them anything. Instead, give them a tool, the use of which will lead to new ways of thinking. And that's what I think VR is. That's what I think we can make possible when we leverage it effectively. So let me give you guys an example of that. This is a self-portrait. Here you are, all of you, right here. This is Earthrise, taken by the Apollo 8 astronauts in 1968. Let's look at another self-portrait. This is one you may have seen in school as you were growing up. The solar system. Here we are yet again, orbiting the sun. But here is what's really happening. This is again by Buckminster Fuller. It is from Synergetics in 1975, and I'll read it to you in case you can't see it. Reality, in case you didn't know, is spiroorbital. All terrestrial critical path developments inherently orbit the sun. No path can be linear. All paths are precessionally modulated by remotely operative forces producing spiralinear paths. All of you understood that, right? This is what it actually means. That's us. That's the world we exist inside. That's the truth of your experience as best as I can model it for you right now. These are the kinds of changes that VR makes possible for us. We can come to understand the world more deeply, more kinesthetically, more intimately. And that's what I hope all of you, if you will look into it, explore it, and come to know it, might be able to do with this technology. If you all have questions, find me on Twitter. Thank you so much.